The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. Our topic today is higher states of consciousness and the superconscious mind. What is their impact on our society today, and what is their implication for our sense of human identity? With me is Kevin Ryerson, noted intuitive and trance channel. Kevin has been quite instrumental in for example, introducing Shirley MacLaine to many concepts in the field of metaphysics, and he has been the subject of 3 books written by her, as well as several other books on channeling and books on psychoimmunity and the healing process. Kevin is also an officer of the California Society for Psychical Study. Welcome, Kevin. You know, it seems as if we're in a burgeoning new area where we hear such terms as transpersonal psychology in the field of altered states of consciousness, and much talk about spiritual reality, the New Age, the Aquarian Age, higher states of consciousness in our culture. It's as if people are becoming more and more aware, Kevin, that this is not just airy-fairy metaphysics, but something that is of great practical value for people in solving day-to-day problems.
Well, I think, Jeffrey, just in defining the term superconscious, when you mentioned the term transpersonal psychology and the implications of such fields as parapsychology and people beginning to accept these and their impacts on society, these things have their roots deeper in our culture than what people, of course, are first aware of. Parapsychology, of course, there's over a well-developed body of information of over a century of research into this particular field.
And perhaps millennia prior to that.
Exactly, exactly. Mm-hmm. If you will, it's very much the documentation in the mystical worldview that societies have always subscribed to. The very term parapsychology itself, coined by William James, was an attempt to describe the psychological states that people adhere to before the development of modern psychology, of course, as founded by Freud. I think what other people are, at times, in particular, increasing their awareness of is phenomena such as the theories and the application of those theories of people such as Carl Jung, who was the founder of analytical psychology. And people are increasing their awareness through popular works such as Shirley MacLaine's books, which I had the fortunate privilege of being associated with Shirley. And Shirley was looked at as much more than just her expertise that she holds in her own profession of acting. She has been looked at for many years as a legitimate commentator on the social scene and an excellent and very keen observer of human affairs. Of course, she was noted for her work in early activism in civil rights, later on the feminist movement, and her association in the labor movement. Her delivering the nomination speech for presidential candidate at the Democratic Convention. So here you have a very credible observer of human event repopularizing these issues. And I use the term repopularizing, maybe even renaissance is a better term.
And it seems as if she's making some very basic statements that are hard to disagree with, such as take responsibility for yourself.
Those are real keys. Those are real keys. But I think if you look at the more academic or perhaps the more clinical and disciplined studies, there's fascinating things that are coming through on the idea of taking superconsciousness as a more literal phenomenon. The model that I present to people is the idea that the same way that when the subconscious mind became an accepted norm in our society, it had tremendous social impact in the areas, for instance, in our criminal justice system, whereas in the sentencing phases it became virtually absolutely necessary to take into account the whole person's behavior, the whole person's experience, to actually judge who is this person in light of what their actions and how are they accountable for those actions based on this whole area at that time, which was somewhat of a mystery, called the subconscious. Tremendous implications in the medical fields, of course, clearly now defining or separating what is considered to be psychosomatic from that which is actually pathological in nature, and adding a whole new dimension as to how we look at ourselves as human beings. And I think that there is a tremendous revolution that is coming in the area when we begin to accept what is referred to as superconsciousness, or perhaps as Jung best defined it, the idea of a collective unconscious, and defining exactly what that means.
Well, it's as if, Freud really shocked Western civilization when he suggested that we are not conscious of our motives, and that our behavior is controlled by forces of which we are not conscious. There was an enormous resistance to his ideas, and then they became accepted as orthodox. And it seems as if the notion of higher consciousness or superconsciousness is suggesting that the very hidden motives that Freud described so carefully can become conscious. Now that we've admitted that we're not conscious, we can bring them into the light of consciousness.
Well, I think that what Freud did is he established, of course, the scientific method to investigate these particular fields. People such as William James, and certainly people such as Carl Jung, were very open to the idea that there can be a scientific arm, if you will, in parapsychology to begin to explore perhaps the deeper roots of our nature. Clearly, our society has come to accept the idea of the effectiveness, even if it's just a placebo effect, of the research of what is now known as past life therapy. There are fascinating or intriguing studies being done in the impact of the near-death experience. When you said that Freud shocked our society, our culture, I find that fascinating, and the idea that our motivations were subliminal, because these, of course, are very much the norm in Hindu religious and Buddhist religious systems of thought, which I prefer to the terms Hindu psychology or the term Buddhist psychology, because their models of psychology are really not that different than what has been reaffirmed by Freud and what has been more accurately, in my opinion, described by the models of psychology promoted by Carl Jung with his theorems of the collective unconscious. I would describe orthodox psychology as stating that the same way that we can look at actions in our childhood and then have a much better command and knowledge of our adult behavior, it has been stated for a long time in Buddhist psychology that what is called karma, which is, of course, a popular California word, simply means action taken. And what they were taking into account was a slightly more expansive model that we as conscious beings do survive and have our roots of our consciousness in other lifetimes, and that the actions in those lifetimes contribute just as much relevance to our affairs, our behaviors in this lifetime, and those just remain just below the surface in this dimension we call the collective unconscious or superconsciousness itself. I think then, if you take that one step further, you really get into having to re-examine what is the identity of this person. The same way a psychologist or people in the legal system have to look at who is this person that is standing before me right here and now. What can I hold him accountable for in his behavior? I mean, what is the roots of his identity? And the fascinating implication is that with these superconscious or collective unconscious models of ourselves, is that once you examine or exhaust the roots of behavior in past lives, and once you exhaust whatever we may be in some future potential lives for people who subscribe to reincarnation, what is left over after that? And that is some of the mysteries that are classically explored, of course, in theology. What is the roots of the human identity? Who are we? Buddhist psychology attempted to answer that by saying the purpose of what we are here in life for is to remember who we are. And that is precisely what the attempts are in most psychology, is to go back and remember the roots of our childhood and bring that into consciousness. And the challenges in most of the theologies or psychologies is to remember who we are. and there's tremendous implications in the models of superconsciousness or the multidimensional personality as is referred to in other metaphysical systems of thought.
Well, certainly Freudian psychology has developed a procedure often taking 6 or 7 years called psychoanalysis just to figure out, how was I toilet trained? How did I learn to suck? Where did I get fixated? At what stage of my development? And then the spiritual psychologies, as you pointed out, go beyond that to past lives. Where does it end?
Well, I think that interestingly enough, you don't have to necessarily go to the mystical worldviews to summarize that particular argument. I think the two definitive and classic minds on this are, of course, Jung and Freud. There really was not too great a divergences in their methodologies. Their methodologies were very similar. There was a divergency, perhaps, ultimately in the issue of the identity, or what is referred to in psychology, the seed of the id. I can almost paraphrase a conversation I could see between these two gentlemen where Mr. Freud would make the statement, Mr. Jung, it is my belief that the seed of our identity, the core of identity, therein all of our suppressed sexual energies, that is really the motivating, driving force behind us. Whereas Carl Jung says, well, I beg to differ with you, Mr. Freud, in their gentlemanly Victorian manner, and would say, in the seed of the id, therein lies God, which takes you into a larger cosmology. Humanism itself, even if we were just limited to the social pressures on us, the human being would still be at the center of creating what we refer to as our society, so therefore our reality is an existential extension of ourselves out into and becoming a social force. But I think when you take the more literalist approach of the mystical worldview, which certainly there are modest bodies of evidence contributing to that, the phenomenon of telepathy and ESP demonstrating that thought can function independent of the physical body, certainly not proven, but well-observed phenomena such as out-of-body experiences that are being now observed and documented, NDE, the near-death experience, where people again have an identity independent of just this one particular lifetime.
And the symbolism of dreams, if we incorporate these into our identity, as Jung and Freud both suggested. I recall in Jung's autobiography, he described that perhaps one of the most profound dreams of his life in understanding the human relationship to God was a dream in which Jung saw God defecating on a church. And he was greatly disturbed by this dream because I guess it seemed to shatter all of his conventional notions of God and religion. But through working it out psychologically and exploring the alchemical symbolism of all of this, Jung seemed to come to a deeper, a richer understanding of the God within, the God that transcends any social definition that can be opposed and who works within us as a vibrant, living force of great power, as that image suggests.
Well, even, Jeffrey, I think my credentials are primarily theological in nature, to give commentary on these things. Even the implications of some of our more rigid, but I like to still think rigorous systems of thought, say such as Judeo-Christian values, even where the issue of the identity of God is crystallized in the person of the man Jesus per se, we still have a cross comparison to many other psychologies, such as Buddhist psychology. Freud's model is that you build a healthy ego in which to function in society. Buddhist psychology says that you must destroy the ego in order to obtain nirvana or your ultimate identity. But in a way, there's a harmony in those that are even united in Judeo-Christian values. St. Paul, who was on his way to persecute this new radical social force called Christianity, had a mystical encounter of something that took him beyond his old exclusively Judaic identity per se, as it was shaped and molded rigidly by the law. And having such a mystical or transcendental encounter, his ego, if you will, as he knew it then, became destroyed. But he took up the crudgements of a new identity in a greater personal relevance of an interchange in his inner values that allowed him to see things in a much broader sociological context, the larger, more universal import of the Christian message, which is the idea that God is in each and every one of us, that we all become the sons and daughters of God. And the important thing, I think, is that when a person does that, what then does God, what is God, and how do we identify God? And I think the more fascinating thing, both philosophically, and I have a tendency to be a literalist on this, is the idea that God is love. There's many passages that describe God's nature, but there's only one that says that God is love. And I think that if we adhere to that principle per se, we can really bring in a whole transformative force in comfortably accepting the idea that God is within us per se, because it takes it outside the realm that God punishes or rewards. It really is a statement as to what human nature itself should be.
Mm-hmm. If we take this statement seriously, God is love, then to be close to God, to know God, is to love. And I suppose we have to look at what our own blocks are. Where do we stop ourselves from loving, from opening up to other individuals at that level?
I think that the same way that Paul, as a man very knowledgeable in a moral system and in ways that we are to conduct ourselves, was able to begin to embrace a much broader amount of other people's identities, the Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, seeing them all, if you will, as all having the potential of receiving as though this divine inspiration within them. I think you really cannot find a limit to it. It's like trying to define the limits of the imagination. And the fascinating thing to me is how much our society is beginning to reflect this particular, not desperate search, but very defined search. It's like maybe the ultimate act of intuition or direct knowledge is to know who we are. Very recently, even on the cover of Discovery magazine, there was a fascinating article that refers to as the anthropomorphic models of the universe, the idea that man's search for his relationship to the physical universe is maybe more honestly a mystical journey for the physicist to that maybe it is more of a religious experience. There was put there somewhat intriguingly, they said that a physicist speculated the idea that stars existed to create carbon, so that carbon could in turn create a life form that could eventually evolve and become conscious of itself to create a physicist, so that the physicist could observe the universe so the universe could exist.
Yes.
And it's really, even in the hard sciences, even outside the psychological models, we come into this constant confrontation as to what our relationship is to ourselves as individuals, in our interpersonal relationships, in our society, and even as mentioned in the search for physics, in particular, probably best expressed philosophically in the Tao of physics, or the way of physics. There's really a search for who we are in relation to the cosmos.
Mm-hmm. And there's a sense in which we are precipitated right out of the cosmos. That well, the religious traditions talk about in the beginning there was light, and light created matter, and then matter somehow grew. It became dense, and molecules were formed, and somehow these molecules began moving a little bit, accepting light inside of them, becoming complex carbon molecules, and then a miracle occurred, I suppose.
Well, that's the fascinating thing, I think, about our position to observe or explore these things today. I think it used to be thought of the idea that what is our relationship to cosmos, which cosmos simply means a harmonious way of things, the way things interrelate, might have been beyond the grasp of our ability to comprehend or apply the method of knowledge that is called science. I beg to differ at that. I go by the standard that we can bridge the gap between science and spirituality, because they're both just merely two methods of gaining knowledge about ourselves. And I think there's more evidence now for the mystical worldview, which is the idea there is no separation between us and nature with a conscious link to cosmos per se. And science itself is actually documenting that. One of my favorite quotes comes from a non-physical being that once stated, says, "Science is the scribe that documents what God already knows." And really, what science is a methodology for using our inner search, seeking what our identity is within ourselves.
So when we talk about the superconscious mind, are we then speaking of the part of us which is in touch with God, who already knows?
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. A fascinating philosophical thought that was presented to me by a friend of mine by the name of Terrell Medaner is the idea that when we know something, we really don't think about it. And there was a philosopher who says, "I think, therefore I am." And God, as a being who knows everything, really knowing everything, does not have the capacity to think. So therefore does not exist as we
the way we do,
exactly, in trying to rationalize, into trying to rationalize it. And that is why there is the biblical statement in the Old Testament that is why God said, rather than saying, "I think, therefore I am," God said merely that I am that I am. And I think that when we can begin to reclaim and re-embrace that aspect of our identity, such as Buddhist psychology encourages us to do, such as Hindu psychology in an attempt to merge with a higher identity, such as Judeo-Christian values give us permission to do that, either through keeping the law or through identification with the man Jesus, who it is said with the divine was revealed within his nature as a blueprint for us to reobtain that knowledge. I think that God is identifiable within us.
There's a sense in which in our time now we're moving in two directions as we move into the realm of the superconscious and this intuitive direct connection of God. We're also simultaneously reaching out through the realm of the senses, through the realms of science, to the very edges of the physical universe, to the tiniest pieces of matter, and somehow these two areas of exploration seem to be in our age merging into like a unified higher consciousness.
That I think is what we are really looking at, is the idea that we are not just subconscious beings. We are not just the conditioning of this particular lifetime, or for that matter, any one particular lifetime. That our consciousness, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And I think what is being proposed is that, again, with extrasensory phenomena, telepathy, out-of-body experiences, we can certainly hypothesize, if not have absolute conclusions just yet, that consciousness perhaps did precede matter and more or less interfaces with matter rather than being synonymous or limiting ourselves to exclusively a material existence, that we are conscious beings. And that is what superconsciousness is an outreach to reclaim that aspect of our identity. The same way that Freud rescued the concept of the subconscious and brought it back into the fore and demonstrated it in society, because certainly the Greeks and the Transcendentalists, many years before Freud, at least suspected this element of ourselves and gave it spiritual attributes. And I think that through transpersonal psychology, parapsychology, and applying the theories of analytical psychology of Jung, we are reclaiming that aspect of our identity also.
I can imagine a positivist skeptic, perhaps, if watching this conversation, Kevin, might make the accusation, as many do, about metaphysical thinking, that, well, it's unfalsifiable, it's unverifiable, therefore it's meaningless. And yet I sense, as we talk about these realities, that meaning, in many cases, in the realm of the superconscious mind, doesn't come from verifiability. Meaning comes from the ability of these speculations to stimulate our imagination, so that our mind expands, and through the imagination of these realms we move into the superconscious realm.
Well, I think that if you were to clearly identify that, I think it's safe to say that orthodox psychology reduces this to behaviorism. It reduces this to behaviorism, and more or less just speculates on the conditionings that we had in childhood as the exclusive roots of our the way we interface with society and each other. So I think that even if there was not a literalness to the spiritual dimension, such as we have been discussing, even if just our spiritual dimension was the impact of our spiritual beliefs, the impact of the way we feel about nature.
Even a behaviorist would have to acknowledge this is a form of behavior.
Exactly. It is certainly part of a model that only now that transpersonal psychology and those practicing the psychology of Jung have always acknowledged, per se, that even if you just reduce the spiritual dimension to that, it is the tremendous power of the imagination, the ability to transcend just our cultural and physical conditioning that would be a clear model for an application of superconsciousness.
If we reach a little deeper, Kevin, into the idea that we have God within us, that we are God. I recall part of Out on a Limb, in which Shirley MacLaine, who you worked with, and I sometimes get embarrassed about quoting her too much, but she made an interesting statement. You know, if I were God, if I thought I was God, it would go to my head. And yet there's a sense in which we have to move beyond that. There's a deeper level that we can reach into and grasp and make that idea, in spite of all of its unverifiability and absurdity, somehow a living force in our lives.
Well, I think that's where the key is that I think that a spiritual dimension is certainly verifiable. You cannot argue with results. Art and culture alone are always attributed to a transcendental nature in humans, in the human spirit. Just our very ability to examine ourselves separates us from other aspects of evolution on this particular plane, and that is a transcendental nature. So there are certainly results in our society. Only as I think as we began to define these things in transpersonal psychology are we beginning to look at these things. And Shirley MacLaine, certainly as an observer or a journalist, has certainly looked at the overview of the impact that these things have had, certainly on her as an individual and society as a whole. And finally, you know, if the idea of God goes to our head, I think that we have the wrong concept of God, because if we allow God to go to our hearts, and if God is love, and if it's as we think in our hearts that we are, then I think that we're accomplishing the effect as to what this dimension called superconsciousness should have as an active force in our lives.
Yeah. Kevin Ryerson, it's a pleasure to be with you. I feel that, you know, just the experience of communicating with you like this is an opening of the heart and an act of self-observation. And I suppose that underneath all the words, those are the things that count. Thank you very much for being with me.
Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you very much for being with us.